The bulldozers arrived at dawn, just like Margaret Chen had planned. But they weren't headed for the condemned nursing home where her parents had spent their final years. They were rolling straight toward the pristine Willowbrook HOA headquarters. As the first wall crumbled, Margaret stood in the shadow of what used to be Sunset Manor, holding the deed that would change everything. 3 months ago, they'd destroyed her family's last sanctuary. Today, she was about to teach them that some victories come with a price they never saw coming. The fluorescent lights in Sunset Manor's main corridor had been flickering for 3 weeks, casting intermittent shadows across the yellowed linoleum that Margaret Chen knew by heart. She pushed her father's wheelchair slowly down the familiar hallway, her mother shuffling beside them with her walker, both of them moving toward an uncertain future that Margaret had fought desperately to prevent. "The new place will be nice, Dad," Margaret said, forcing optimism into her voice as they passed the empty rooms that had once housed their neighbors. "Riverside Gardens has better facilities. More activities." Frank Chen's weathered hands gripped the wheelchair's armrests. At 83, her father had survived the Korean War, built a successful restaurant from nothing, and raised 4 children. But Sunset Manor's closure had broken something fundamental in him. 42 years we lived in this neighborhood, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 42 years, and they tear it down for what? More McMansions. Margaret's mother, Rose, stopped walking and turned toward the window overlooking the garden where she'd spent countless afternoons. "The roses won't survive the winter without someone to tend them," she said, her arthritic fingers tracing patterns on the glass. "I planted those climbing roses myself when we first moved in." "That was when was that, Frank?" 1987, her father replied. "You said this place would be our last home." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She'd heard this conversation a dozen times in the past month, each repetition carving deeper into her resolve. "Mom, they are just plants. The new facility has gardens too." Rose Chen turned to face her daughter, and Margaret saw something fierce flicker in her mother's eyes, a ghost of the woman who had once run the family restaurant's front of house with military precision. "They are not just plants, Margaret. They are home." The sound of construction equipment rumbling to life outside made them all turn toward the window. Across the street, workers were already breaking ground on what would become another row of identical luxury homes, part of the Willowbrook Estates development that had been systematically transforming their neighborhood for the past 5 years. Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed the number she'd memorized. "Mr. Harrison. It's Margaret Chen again. I wanted to discuss the Sunset Manor situation one more time." James Harrison's voice carried the practiced patience of a man who'd dealt with countless property disputes. As president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association, he'd become the face of the neighborhood's transformation. "Ms. Chen, we've been through this. The nursing home violates multiple HOA covenants. The building is grandfathered, yes, but the recent health department citations void that protection. We've given the residents 4 months to relocate, that's more than generous. My parents have lived in this neighborhood longer than your HOA has existed," Margaret said, watching a crane position itself outside the window. "They deserve better than 4 months' notice." "The property owner accepted our buyout offer," Harrison replied. "This isn't personal, Ms. Chen. It's about maintaining property values for all residents. Sunset Manor sits on prime real estate that could house 3 families instead of warehousing," he caught himself. "Instead of warehousing what, Mr. Harrison?" "Senior citizens." The line went quiet for several seconds. "I misspoke. But the decision is final. The demolition permit was approved this morning." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "This morning? But the residents have until Friday. Today is Wednesday. I suggest you expedite your parents' move." The call ended, leaving Margaret staring at her phone in disbelief. She turned to find both her parents watching her with the resigned expressions of people who'd lived long enough to recognize when a fight was truly over. "They moved up the demolition," she said quietly. Frank Chen's hands tightened on his wheelchair. "How long do we have?" 2 days. Rose Chen sank into a nearby chair, suddenly looking every one of her 81 years. "I can't pack 40 years in 2 days, Margaret. I don't know how." Margaret knelt beside her mother's chair, taking Rose's hands in hers. We'll figure it out, Mom. We always do. But as she looked around the facility that had been her parents' home for nearly 4 decades, Margaret felt a rage building that surprised her with its intensity. This wasn't just about property values or HOA covenants. This was about a community's right to exist, about honoring the people who'd built something meaningful in this corner of the world. She pulled out her laptop and began researching. Property records, HOA bylaws, zoning regulations, permit applications, anything that might give her leverage in a fight she was increasingly convinced she couldn't win through conventional means. 3 hours later, she'd found something interesting. The Willowbrook HOA headquarters occupied a prime corner lot that had been donated to the community organization in 1995 by the original developer. The deed included a specific clause requiring the property to be used exclusively for community benefit and resident services. But according to the tax records Margaret had pulled, the HOA had been renting out portions of the building to a private law firm for the past 3 years. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her brother David in Seattle, saw the news about Sunset Manor online. "I can fly out Friday if you need help with the move." She stared at the message, struck by how quickly her family's crisis had become just another real estate transaction in the public record. Her parents' displacement was literally newsworthy now, a human interest story about gentrification and senior housing shortages. "Margaret." Her mother's voice drew her back to the present. "There's something I need to show you." Rose Chen led her daughter to the small office behind the main desk, where she pulled out a manila folder that had been tucked behind some old photo albums. Inside were dozens of documents, permits, inspections, correspondence with city officials, dating back to the 1980s. "Your father and I weren't just residents here," Rose said. "We were part owners. When the original nursing home corporation went bankrupt in 1994, a group of us bought shares to keep it operating as a cooperative." Margaret flipped through the papers, her hands trembling slightly. "Mom, why didn't you tell me this before? We thought it didn't matter anymore. The corporation dissolved years ago, and we just kept living here." Rose pointed to a document near the bottom of the stack. "But according to this, we still own 12% of the underlying property." Margaret stared at the deed in her hands. Her parents didn't just live at Sunset Manor, they owned part of it. Which meant the HOA's forced buyout of the property owner might not be as legally straightforward as James Harrison had suggested. She spent the next hour on the phone with a real estate attorney, learning that her parents' ownership stake had never been properly dissolved and that the recent sale might be challengeable in court. It would take months to resolve, but it gave them grounds for an injunction to stop the demolition. By 5 o'clock, Margaret had filed an emergency motion with the county court system. By 6 o'clock, James Harrison was calling her back. "Ms. Chen, I understand you filed some kind of legal challenge," he said, his voice tight with controlled irritation. "I want you to know that the HOA takes these matters seriously, but frivolous lawsuits won't change the outcome here." "It's not frivolous if my parents legally own part of the property you're trying to demolish," Margaret replied. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Harrison spoke again. "Even if that were true, it wouldn't stop the demolition. The health department citations are still valid. The building is still in violation of multiple safety codes. Violations that could be addressed with proper maintenance and investment," Margaret said. "The kind of investment the HOA could have supported instead of fighting for 5 years to get rid of the facility. The HOA's responsibility is to its members, not to subsidize failing businesses." "My parents aren't a business, Mr. Harrison. They're your neighbors." "Not anymore," he said, and hung up. Margaret stared at her phone, feeling something fundamental shift inside her. This wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. This was about the kind of community Willowbrook was going to become, and whether there was room in it for people like her parents. She walked back to the main room where her father was helping other residents pack their belongings. Most of them were in their 70s and 80s, people who'd lived through wars and economic upheavals and personal tragedies that had taught them how to endure. But there was something defeated in their movements now, a quiet acceptance of displacement that broke Margaret's heart. "Dad," she said, pulling Frank aside. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Frank Chen looked at his daughter with. Margaret kept her keys in her hand as she approached Harrison, every instinct telling her to maintain distance from a man who'd shown up uninvited at her home after dark. "This is private property, Mr. Harrison. What do you want?" Harrison straightened up from the sedan, and Margaret noticed he wasn't alone. A woman in her 40s sat in the passenger seat, watching them through the window with the detached interest of someone accustomed to uncomfortable conversations. "I want to help you understand the full scope of what you're dealing with," Harrison said. "May I introduce Deputy County Assessor Linda Walsh? She's here to discuss the tax situation at Sunset Manor." Walsh stepped out of the car, carrying a thick manila folder. "Miss Chen, I tried calling your attorney's office, but they said you'd prefer to handle this directly. The tax assessment on the Sunset Manor property is complicated." Margaret felt her stomach clench. "Complicated how?" "Your parents' ownership stake comes with proportional responsibility for all back taxes and penalties," Walsh said, opening her folder. "The property hasn't had a proper assessment in 12 years. When we finally conducted one last month, we found significant undervaluation going back to 2015. "Meaning what, exactly?" Harrison answered before Walsh could respond. "Meaning your family owes the county approximately $73,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest. Due immediately." Margaret stared at him. "That's impossible. My parents have been paying their property taxes through the facilities management company." "The management company was paying taxes on the residential portion only," Walsh explained. "They weren't aware of the ownership shares or the commercial assessment on the common areas. It's an honest mistake, but the law doesn't distinguish between honest mistakes and willful evasion." Margaret's mind raced through the implications. Even if she could somehow raise $73,000, it would wipe out her parents' retirement savings and her own emergency fund. There has to be some kind of payment plan. Some way to resolve this over time. "There is," Harrison said, and something in his tone made Margaret's skin crawl. "The county is willing to forgive the entire tax debt in exchange for your parents signing over their ownership interest to the Willowbrook Community Development Fund." "Which is what, exactly?" "A non-profit organization dedicated to responsible neighborhood development," Harrison said smoothly. "Your parents would retain the right to live at Sunset Manor through the end of their natural lives, and the fund would take responsibility for bringing the facility into code compliance." Margaret felt the trap closing around them. "And what happens to the other residents? The ones who don't have ownership stakes?" "They would need to relocate, of course. The renovated facility would have fewer units but higher standards of care." "You're talking about gentrifying a nursing home," Margaret said flatly. Walsh cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Miss Chen, I understand this is difficult, but the county has to collect its revenue. If the tax debt isn't resolved by Friday, we'll have to initiate foreclosure proceedings." "Friday?" Margaret felt her voice rise. "You're giving us 2 days to come up with $73,000. "You've had years to resolve this," Harrison said. "The fact that your parents didn't know about their tax obligations doesn't make those obligations disappear." Margaret looked back and forth between them, recognizing the coordination of their approach. This wasn't coincidence. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning what?" Harrison asked innocently. "This entire scenario. The health violations, the buyout offer, the tax assessment. How long have you been working to force my parents out?" Walsh shifted uncomfortably, but Harrison's expression didn't change. "Miss Chen, I think you're attributing more sophistication to county bureaucracy than actually exists. Sometimes things just happen to align." "Things don't just align this perfectly by accident," Margaret said. She pulled out her phone and started recording. "I want both of you to explain, on record, why the county suddenly discovered a 12-year tax assessment error at the exact same time the HOA pushed through a demolition order." Walsh took a step backward. "Miss Chen, I don't think, turn that off," Harrison said sharply. "This is a private conversation. On my private property." "With public officials making demands about public tax records," Margaret replied, keeping the phone steady. This seems like exactly the kind of thing the public should know about. Harrison's jaw tightened. You're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. Your parents are in their 80s. They shouldn't be dealing with legal battles and financial stress at their age. You're right, Margaret said. They shouldn't be. But you made that choice for them when you decided their home was more valuable as real estate than as a place where people actually live. Nobody's forcing anyone to do anything, Harrison said. We are offering solutions. Solutions that happen. To benefit the Willowbrook Community Development Fund, which I'm guessing has some interesting connections to the HOA board. Margaret caught the quick glance that passed between Harrison and Walsh and felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. She'd spent the afternoon researching property records, but she hadn't looked deeply enough into the nonprofit organizations involved in the neighborhood's development. I'm going to need until Monday to review this tax situation with my attorney, she said. The county deadline is Friday, Walsh repeated. Then I guess the county is going to have to explain to a judge why they are rushing a foreclosure on a property that's currently under a court-ordered restraining order. Walsh looked genuinely confused. What restraining order? Harrison's face had gone pale. She filed an emergency injunction to stop the demolition. The property can't be sold or transferred until the ownership dispute is resolved. Which means the county can't foreclose until the court case is finished, Margaret said, understanding flooding through her. Unless you're planning to violate a court order. Walsh closed her folder abruptly. I need to consult with the county attorney's office. This is outside my area of expertise. She got back in the sedan without another word, leaving Harrison standing in Margaret's driveway with an expression of barely controlled fury. You're playing a dangerous game, he said. Quietly. I'm protecting my family, Margaret replied. If that feels dangerous to you, maybe you should ask yourself why. Harrison got in his car and drove away without responding, but Margaret noticed he turned toward the Willowbrook HOA headquarters instead of toward the residential area where she assumed he lived. She went inside and immediately called her attorney, David Kim, explaining the tax situation and the evening's confrontation. Kim listened without interrupting, then let out a long sigh. Margaret, this changes everything. Even with the injunction, if the county has legitimate tax claims, they can force a sale regardless of the ownership dispute. Can they really collect 12 years of back taxes based on an assessment they never bothered to make until now? Legally? Probably. The county has broad authority to reassess property values and collect unpaid taxes. But the timing is suspicious. Enough that we might be able to challenge the assessment itself. What would that take? Time, money, and a property appraiser willing to testify that the county's assessment is inflated. We are talking about months of litigation and tens of thousands in legal fees. Margaret sat down heavily at her kitchen table. There has to be another way. There might be. I've been looking into the Willowbrook Community Development Fund that Harrison mentioned. It's registered as a 501c3, but the board members are interesting. Interesting how? James Harrison is the president. The secretary is Patricia Morrison, who happens to be married to the county assessor. The treasurer is Michael Sterling, from the law firm representing the HOA. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. They created a nonprofit to buy property from people they are forcing out. It looks that way. And if I'm reading the tax records correctly, they've acquired 6 other properties in the neighborhood over the past 3 years, always from elderly residents facing sudden tax assessments or code violations. That's not neighborhood development, Margaret said. That's systematic displacement. It's also potentially illegal if we can prove coordination between the HOA, the county, and the nonprofit. But proving it would require access to internal communications, financial records, things we can't get without a formal investigation. Margaret thought about the threatening text messages, the perfectly timed tax assessment, the coordinated pressure from multiple agencies. What if someone was willing to go undercover? To get close enough to these people to document what they are actually doing? Margaret, that's incredibly risky. If they are willing to threaten you over a nursing home, what do you think they'd do if they caught you gathering evidence of criminal activity? They are already threatening me. They are already trying to destroy my family. How much worse can it get? Kim was quiet for a long moment. There's something else you should know. I did some research on similar cases around the state. This pattern, elderly residents facing sudden tax bills, non-profit organizations swooping in with the solutions, properties being transferred and then immediately redeveloped, it's happened in at least 4 other counties in the past 5 years. Are you saying this is bigger than just Willowbrook? I'm saying this might be a business mod. Margaret's brother David arrived on the red-eye flight Thursday morning, looking like he'd aged 5 years since she'd last seen him at Christmas. The software engineer who'd once debugged complex systems for government contracts now sat across from her at the kitchen table, staring at printouts of property records and tax assessments with the hollow expression of someone whose carefully constructed life had just been threatened by strangers. They called my boss directly, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Told him there were concerns about my family's involvement in legal disputes that might affect my security clearance. Suggested it might be wise to put me on administrative leave pending an investigation. Margaret felt sick. David, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to, don't. He held up a hand. Mom and Dad raised us better than to back down from bullies. But we need to be smart about this. These people have resources we can't match in a straight fight. Then we don't fight straight, Margaret said. She pulled out her laptop and opened the files she'd been compiling since Tuesday. Look at this pattern. 6 properties in Willowbrook, 14 properties in adjacent neighborhoods, 43 properties across the county. All elderly residents, all sudden tax bills or code violations, all ending up owned by non-profit organizations with suspiciously similar board members. David studied the spreadsheet, his programmer's mind automatically looking for patterns in the data. This is systematic. Industrial scale. He pointed to a column of dates. Look at the timing. They are not doing this randomly. They are targeting specific properties in a specific sequence. Targeting them how? David pulled up a mapping application on his phone and started plotting addresses. They are creating corridors. See? They acquire properties along major streets first, then fill in the blocks behind them. It's like they are building a development plan one property at a time. Margaret stared at the emerging pattern on the map. They are not just displacing families. They are redesigning entire neighborhoods. And making a fortune doing it. Look at these resale prices. David pointed to another column in the spreadsheet. Properties acquired for tax debt or code violations, then sold within 6 months for 3 to 5 times the assessed value. That's not neighborhood revitalization, Margaret said. That's land speculation using government agencies as enforcement. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Patterson, emergency meeting at Sunset Manor. Come now. Margaret and David drove across town in tense silence, both of them processing the implications of what they'd discovered. The scope of the operation was staggering, but it also suggested vulnerabilities. Systems this complex required coordination, communication, documentation. And that meant evidence. They found the activity room at Sunset Manor transformed into something resembling a campaign headquarters. Mrs. Patterson had recruited her granddaughter Jenny from the county clerk's office, who'd brought boxes of photocopied records. Rose Chen was manning a laptop, cross-referencing property sales with newspaper obituaries. Frank Chen and Mr. Kowalski were working through a stack of phone books, compiling contact information for displaced families. What did you find? Margaret asked. Jenny, a young woman in her 20s with her grandmother's sharp eyes, looked up from a pile of documents. More than we expected. The county has been conducting compliance audits on properties owned by elderly residents for the past 3 years. But here's the interesting part, the audits are only conducted on properties that someone specifically requests be reviewed. Someone like who? David asked. Anonymous complaints filed through the county's online portal. Always about potential tax assessment irregularities or possible code violations. Always for properties in neighborhoods targeted for development. Mrs. Patterson handed Margaret a thick folder. We mapped the complaint patterns. 93. Anonymous complaints in 3 years, all targeting the same demographic, all resulting in sudden tax bills or forced sales. Margaret flipped through the documents, her mind racing. Someone has been systematically filing false complaints to trigger government investigations of innocent families. Not false, Jenny corrected. Technically accurate but deliberately misleading. They are exploiting loopholes in the assessment process to force reviews that never would have happened otherwise. Rose Chen looked up from her laptop. I found something else. 7 of the families who lost their homes have died within 6 months of being displaced. 3 of them had no history of serious health problems. The room went quiet. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. You're saying the stress of displacement might have contributed to their deaths? I'm saying that when you force 80-year-old people out of homes they've lived in for decades, there are consequences beyond just financial loss, Rose said firmly. David was studying the map on his phone, comparing it to the documents Jenny had brought. There's something else. The development pattern isn't random. They are targeting properties adjacent to planned infrastructure improvements, new highway access, light rail extensions, commercial development zones. How would they know about infrastructure planning before it's announced publicly? Margaret asked. Inside information, Mrs. Patterson said grimly. Someone with access to city planning documents, county development proposals, state transportation plans. Margaret's phone rang. Sarah Martinez, the reporter. Margaret, I've been digging deeper into the financial connections you asked me to investigate, Martinez said. The Willowbrook Community Development Fund receives significant donations from something called the Regional Growth Partnership. That organization is funded by a consortium of construction companies, real estate developers, and financial firms. So it's a money laundering operation. It's more sophisticated than that. It's a legitimate nonprofit that happens to be funded by companies that benefit directly from the properties it acquires. Not illegal, but definitely ethically questionable. What about the coordination with county officials? That's where it gets interesting. I found email records showing that Patricia Morrison, the county assessor's wife who sits on the Development Fund board, has been receiving consulting fees from several of the companies that benefit from these property acquisitions. Margaret felt the pieces clicking together. She's being paid to provide inside information about which properties to target. That's what it looks like. But proving it would require access to internal communications that I can't get without a subpoena. What if someone could get access to those communications through other means? Martinez was quiet for a moment. Margaret, be very careful about what you're suggesting. If these people are willing to threaten your brother's career over a property dispute, what do you think they'd do if they caught you gathering evidence of criminal activity? After the call ended, Margaret looked around the room at the faces of people who trusted her to find a way to save their homes. Mrs. Patterson was 73 years old and had spent 40 years as a paralegal, navigating legal systems that often seemed designed to frustrate ordinary people. Rose and Frank Chen were in their 80s, immigrants who'd built successful lives despite discrimination and economic hardship. David was 35 and had security clearance to work on sensitive government projects. Between them, they had knowledge, experience, and access that their opponents didn't know about. I have an idea, Margaret said. But it's risky, and it requires everyone in this room to commit to something that could get us all in serious trouble. What kind of trouble? David asked. The kind where we gather evidence of criminal activity by people who have demonstrated they are willing to destroy lives to protect their operation. Frank Chen spoke up from his position at the phone table. Margaret, your mother and I have lived through wars, economic collapse, and 40 years of building a business from nothing. We know something about risk assessment. This is different. Dad. These aren't abstract market forces or natural disasters. These are people who will actively try to hurt us if they think we're a threat. They are already hurting us, Rose Chen said quietly. The question is whether we are going to let them finish the job. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat. My granddaughter Jenny has access to county records that could confirm the coordination between officials and the development fund. David has technical skills that could help us analyze communication patterns and financial connections. You have project management experience that could help us coordinate a complex investigation. And you have 40 years of legal experience navigating bureaucratic systems, Margaret added. What are you thinking? Jenny asked. Margaret pulled out her laptop and opened a new document. I'm thinking we conduct our own investigation. Thorough, documented, legally bulletproof. We gather evidence of the coordination between county officials, the HOA, and the development fund. We document the pattern of targeting elderly residents. We prove that this is a systematic operation designed to displace vulnerable families. For profit. And then what? David asked. Then we give Sarah Martinez the story of her career, we file formal complaints with every relevant agency, and we make sure that everyone involved faces consequences for what they've done. Jenny leaned forward. The county clerk's office has digital records going back 5 years. Email communique. Judge Patricia Reeves answered her door in a bathrobe and slippers, but her eyes were sharp and alert despite the late hour. She'd been Rose Chen's attorney for 2 decades, handling everything from restaurant permits to immigration paperwork. And she knew the Chen family well enough to recognize crisis when she saw it. Rose, Margaret, she said, stepping aside to let them in. When you called and said it was an emergency, I figured it had to do with Sunset Manor. But this sounds bigger than a property dispute. They sat in Judge Reeves' study, surrounded by law books and case files, while Margaret laid out everything they'd discovered. The coordinated tax assessments, the anonymous complaints, the non-profit organizations with suspicious funding sources, the pattern of displacement across multiple counties. Judge Reeves listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting to see specific documents. This is extensive, she said finally, examining the timeline they'd constructed. And if even half of it is accurate, it represents systematic corruption involving multiple government agencies. Can you help us? Margaret asked. Judge Reeves was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence spread across her coffee table. Margaret, what you're describing requires criminal investigation by state authorities, not emergency judicial intervention. I can't just issue search warrants based on circumstantial evidence and suspicious timing. Margaret felt her heart sink. So there's nothing you can do? I didn't say that. Judge Reeves picked up one of the documents, a county email that Jenny had obtained through public records request. This communication between the assessor's office and the development fund does suggest coordination that violates procurement regulations. And this pattern of complaints. She pointed to another document. Someone has been systematically gaming the assessment process. Is that enough for a warrant? Rose asked. It's enough for an emergency review of the county's compliance with assessment procedures, which would require immediate access to all related communications and financial records. Judge Reeves reached for her phone. I'm calling the State Attorney General's office. They have jurisdiction over municipal corruption cases. While Judge Reeves made her calls, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from David, we have a problem. Multiple sheriff's vehicles just arrived at Sunset Manor. They are posting eviction notices on every door. Margaret showed the message to her mother. They are not waiting until morning. They are moving tonight. Rose Chen's face hardened. Patricia, she called to Judge Reeves, who was still on the phone with state officials. How quickly can you issue an emergency stay? Judge Reeves covered the phone. Based on what? The original restraining order was vacated due to the tax issues. Based on new evidence of criminal activity that calls into question the validity of those tax assessments, Margaret said. If the assessments were fraudulently inflated to force foreclosure, then the county doesn't have legitimate authority to seize the property. Judge Reeves spoke briefly into the phone, then hung up. The State Attorney General is sending investigators, but they won't arrive until tomorrow morning. I can issue a temporary stay until they can review the evidence. But it will only hold if there's probable cause of criminal activity. There is, Margaret said firmly. Patricia Morrison has been receiving consulting fees from companies that benefit from the properties her husband's office assesses. That's textbook bribery. Can you prove it? Margaret pulled out her phone. and called Sarah Martinez. "Sarah, it's Margaret. I need you to send Judge Reeves everything you found about Patricia Morrison's consulting contracts. Email it to her directly, right now." "Margaret, what's happening?" "They are accelerating the evictions. We need documented proof of the corruption tonight, or my parents and 20 other families lose their homes." "Sending it now," Martinez said. "Margaret, be careful. If they are moving this fast, it means they know you're close to something they can't afford to have exposed." While they waited for the documents, Margaret called David. "What's the situation at Sunset Manor?" "Bad. The sheriff's deputies are giving residents until 11 p.m. to clear out. Anyone still here after that gets arrested for trespassing." "Where are people supposed to go?" "That's not the county's problem, apparently. Most of the families don't have anywhere to go on 6 hours' notice." Margaret looked at her watch. It was already 9:30 p.m. "Stole them. Tell them we are getting an emergency court order." "How am I supposed to stall sheriff's deputies?" "Be creative. But don't do anything that gets you arrested." Judge Reeves' computer chimed with incoming emails. She opened Sarah Martinez's documents and began reading, her expression growing grimmer with each page. "This is damning," she said. "Patricia Morrison received $47,000 in consulting fees from regional growth partnership companies over the past 2 years. The same companies that benefited from every property her husband's office flagged for reassessment. Is that enough for a stay?" Rose asked. "It's enough to question the integrity of the entire assessment process," Judge Reeves said, reaching for her legal pad. "I'm issuing an emergency order suspending all enforcement actions related to properties assessed by Morrison's office pending investigation by state authorities." Margaret felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Her phone rang. "David." "Again." "Margaret, you need to get here now. They are not just evicting people. They are seizing personal property as collateral for the tax debt. They are taking everything." "What do you mean, everything?" "Furniture, photo albums, medication, medical equipment. They are loading it all into trucks. Mrs. Patterson is having a panic attack because they took her late husband's war medals." Margaret felt rage building in her chest. "That's not legal. Personal property can't be seized for tax debt without a separate court order. Try telling that to the deputies. They have some kind of blanket seizure warrant." Judge Reeves was listening to Margaret's side of the conversation, her face pale. "That's not possible. I would have been notified of any seizure warrants in my jurisdiction." Margaret put the call on speaker. "David, can you read me the warrant number?" "They won't let me see it. They are saying it's sealed for security reasons." Judge Reeves grabbed her phone and dialed the county sheriff's office directly. After a brief conversation that grew increasingly heated, she hung up and turned to Margaret and Rose. "There is no seizure warrant on file with the court. Whatever authority they are claiming, it's not coming from my jurisdiction." "Then who authorized it?" Margaret asked. "That's what we are going to find out." Judge Reeves was already printing out the emergency stay order. "Rose, I need you to take this to Sunset Manor immediately. Any deputy who continues enforcement actions after being served with this order is in contempt of court." As they prepared to leave, Margaret's phone buzzed with another call from an unknown number. This time, the voice was different, older, with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ms. Chen, this is County Supervisor William Bradley. I understand you've been causing some difficulties for routine municipal operations." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. Bradley was the highest-ranking elected official in the county, with authority over budgets, personnel decisions, and policy implementation. If he was involved, the corruption went to the very top of local government. "Supervisor Bradley, I'm protecting my family's legal rights. If that's causing difficulties for your operations, maybe you should examine those operations more carefully. Ms. Chen, you're playing a dangerous game with forces you don't understand. The Willowbrook Development Project represents millions of dollars in economic growth for this county. Your family's sentimental attachment to an obsolete nursing home cannot be allowed to jeopardize that growth." "Obsolete?" Margaret felt her voice rise. You're talking about people's homes. About a community that's been stable for 40 years. I'm talking about progress, Ms. Chen. Change is difficult, but it's necessary. The county is prepared to offer your family a very generous relocation package if you'll drop your legal challenges and convince your fellow residents to cooperate with the transition. How generous? $200,000. Cash. No questions asked. All you have to do is sign an agreement to cease all legal action and media contact regarding the Willowbrook development. Margaret stared at her phone, stunned by the blatancy of the offer. You're trying to bribe me to abandon my parents and their neighbors. I'm trying to help you understand that this situation has already been decided at levels far above your influence. You can accept a generous settlement and move on with your lives, or you can continue fighting and lose everything you have, including my brother's security clearance. Your brother's employment situation is a separate matter entirely. But yes, continued legal action could have wide-ranging consequences for your entire family. The call ended, leaving Margaret staring at the phone with a mixture of fury and disbelief. The corruption wasn't just local, it reached into county government at the highest levels. Judge Reeves had heard enough of the conversation to understand the implications. Margaret, if County Supervisor Bradley is personally involved in pressuring you to drop legal challenges, that's intimidation of a witness in a corruption investigation. The State Attorney General needs to know about this immediately. As they